The morning of the 19th of February 1945 broke clear and warm, with enough of a breeze to keep the heat at bay. John Basilone and his men completed their usual preparations before their Amtrak rolled down the tongue of the LST roughly 10,000 yards from the shoreline. Around them, ahead of them, and overhead, an overwhelming display of destructive power unfolded with magnificent intensity. The Amtraks advanced steadily until they were about 4,000 yards from shore. To their left, the island's volcano rose gradually into view. At 8 a.m., the naval shelling ceased. Almost immediately, a formation of bombers swept in to attack the island, followed by dozens of carrier aircraft that circled over Iwo Jima for nearly 20 minutes. At 8:25, the aircraft departed, and the naval bombardment resumed. 5 minutes later, the first wave of Amtraks broke from its holding circle, formed into line abreast, and crossed the line of departure. The second wave followed, then the third, before Basilone's own wave aligned itself roughly 300 yards behind the one ahead and continued toward the beach. The Amtraks pushed through the line of battleships, close enough for the men to feel the blast of heat each time another broadside thundered from the naval guns. The firing intensified during the final minutes before ceasing just before 9 a.m. Carrier aircraft returned for another low pass from the south, sweeping past the volcano at about 150 knots while strafing enemy positions. A parachute flare burst above the beach, signaling that the first wave had landed. John's Amtrak was now only a few hundred yards from shore, with Futatsu Rock just off to his left. His LVT crawled onto the beach at 9:12. As he descended the rear ramp, he would have noticed that many of the LVTAs from the first wave were still milling around near the water's edge. They had been expected to push inland and engage targets with their 75mm guns, while empty Amtraks were already grinding their way back toward the waiting ships. As John stepped onto the beach, his boots immediately sank into the deep black sand. Carbine in hand, he struggled toward the base of a black volcanic dune rising 15 to 20 feet above him. No ladders were available. Using both hands to claw upward while driving with his legs, he fought his way to the crest. The loose volcanic ash gave almost no footing, and many Marines were stalled near the top. As his head cleared the ridge, he looked across an exposed stretch of beach toward another, smaller terrace of black sand. A handful of Marines had managed to dash across between bursts of enemy mortar fire, but most remained pinned down. The open beach offered no protection from the exploding mortar rounds. Baker Company had landed on Charlie Beach, and officers together with non-commissioned officers from both companies shouted desperately as they attempted to organize their platoons while massive Navy shells screamed overhead. Japanese mortars burst across the exposed ground, leaving wounded Marines scattered along the next terrace. As gunnery sergeant of Charlie Company, John's responsibility was to ensure his men assembled into their proper squads and fire teams at the designated rendezvous area. Riflemen required their supporting weapons. Machine gun crews needed ammunition bearers. Every Marine expected to fight beside familiar men they trusted, and John worked to organize those teams and get them moving forward. He would have done everything he could, but at about 9:30, the Japanese mortar fire falling on Red Beach increased dramatically. Marines instinctively began digging into the volcanic ash. Each handful they scooped away immediately slid back into the hole, yet there was no other protection. The deafening noise made it impossible to hear anyone shouting from only a few feet away. Like the other officers of Charlie Company, John recognized that the situation was rapidly becoming critical. Rising to his feet, he shouted, "Come on, you guys, we have to get these guns off the beach." Motioning for the nearby Marines to follow, he began driving forward. A small number rose with him. Picking his way through men lying flat in the sand, he crossed to the next terrace, where another broad stretch of exposed black sand lay ahead. The Marines there were hugging the ground beneath intense enemy machine gun fire. John realized he had reached men from the first assault wave because their faces were covered with thick white protective cream intended to guard against burns from gasoline fires, giving them an eerie, ghost-like appearance. With the mortar bombardment raging, shouting instructions was pointless. John simply got up and sprinted toward the next rise, where he found a machine gun team taking cover. He struck the gunner's helmet to get his attention before pointing toward the firing aperture of a concrete blockhouse. The Marine looked around. It was Chuck Tatum, the young Marine from Baker Company whom John had first met a year earlier after returning to duty. Tatum hesitated, uncertain of the target. John directed him to sight along his arm, and immediately the objective became clear. The muzzle of a large caliber gun projected from the concrete blockhouse built into the side of a small ridge, firing toward the beach on their right. Leaning close enough to be heard, John yelled into Tatum's ear, "Get into action on that target!" Tatum dropped the tripod into position while his assistant secured the pintle. They loaded the weapon, and Tatum cocked it before squeezing the trigger. Nothing happened. Opening the breech, he discovered it had become packed with black volcanic sand. Rolling aside, he sent his assistant to retrieve the cleaning kit from his pack, while he carefully cleaned the firing mechanism with a toothbrush. John remained beside him, waiting. Once the cover snapped shut again, Tatum worked the bolt and opened fire. John watched the tracers strike and quickly realized the angle was wrong because the embrasure faced further to the right. He motioned for Tatum to shift position. Tatum and his assistant lifted the Browning and moved roughly 30 yards along the terrace before opening fire again. This time the burst struck accurately, forcing the Japanese inside the blockhouse to stop firing. John had already planned the next step. He sent Peg, a demolition specialist, forward while Tatum's machine gun kept the enemy pinned down. Peg edged closer to the pillbox under cover of the sustained fire. Basilone ran back to Tatum and slapped his helmet, signaling him to cease firing. Peg hurled a satchel charge filled with C2 explosives through the firing slit before sprinting for cover. Everyone nearby ducked as the explosion tore through the position. Once the blast was over, the flamethrower operator moved in. Covered by another short burst from Tatum, he thrust the nozzle into the opening and flooded the interior with long streams of burning fuel. John handed Tatum his carbine, unlocked the Browning from its tripod, gripped the carrying handle with one hand and the rear grip with the other, then charged forward. Reaching the crest of the ridge, he fired from the hip at Japanese soldiers fleeing from the rear of the burning pillbox. Most of the 8 or 9 men were already engulfed in burning napalm as he poured automatic fire into them. It was a textbook assault. Tatum, his assistant gunner, and several riflemen quickly joined him. Basilone exchanged the machine gun for his carbine, signaled them to follow, and led them away from the black volcanic ash into a shattered, nightmarish landscape. The stunted trees and scrub had been burned down to blackened stumps. Coarse grass and twisted branches still smoldered beneath the napalm, while bomb craters scarred the ground, and the maze of low stone walls that had once divided the landscape had been smashed beyond recognition. The group advanced cautiously, stopping often to search for concealed pillboxes and waiting for explosions to subside before moving again. Basilone guided them across the few hundred yards separating the final terrace from the edge of the airfield. Off to their right, a steep embankment marked the end of the main runway, rising well above their heads. They skirted the southern end of the runway before climbing the embankment. Shells burst nearby, forcing them to dive into shell holes for cover. Basilone landed in one alongside Chuck Tatum, the assistant gunner, and 2 riflemen. For a brief moment they caught their breath. One direction revealed wrecked aircraft and scattered equipment with the shell-scarred runway stretching beyond them. In the opposite direction, Mount Suribachi towered some 1,500 yards away. Looking back toward the beach, they saw no sign of anyone following. Tatum checked his watch. It was 10:33 a.m. They had been ashore on Iwo Jima for just over an hour and a half. The enemy bombardment intensified. Some of the shells appeared to be coming from Suribachi behind them, while others came from the far side of the airfield. Then the Navy's own artillery began landing dangerously close as the rolling barrage shifted back across their position. It felt as though they were sitting directly in the center of the target area. 2 Marines began edging back toward the beach, but John stopped them. "We took this ground, and now it's up to us to hold it. Dig in. I'm going back for more men, so stay here come hell or high water." With that, he turned and ran back toward the beach. Descending the terraces at full speed, John encountered 3 tanks struggling to negotiate the broken ground, terraces, and minefields. Tanks naturally attracted enemy fire, and the crews had already suffered heavy losses. Standard procedure required infantrymen to move behind the tanks, use the field telephone mounted on the rear, and direct them from relative cover. Instead, Basilone deliberately walked out in front of the lead tank where the crew could clearly see him. By exposing himself to enemy fire, he reassured the nervous tankers, who had already watched 4 of their comrades killed. Remaining remarkably calm, he guided the tanks safely onto firmer ground. Once they began pushing forward into the brush, John sprinted back toward Red Beach. Hundreds of Marines watched in disbelief from the relative safety of shell holes as he crossed ground few men dared to expose themselves upon. By now, the enemy barrage on Red Beach had reached an overwhelming intensity. Heavy artillery shells crashed down in regular patterns, advancing parallel to the shoreline before shifting 100 feet either toward or away from the beach and then sweeping back again. Heavy mortars poured down continuously, adding to the devastation. The sheer violence assaulted every sense. Every Marine knew instinctively that the only chance of survival lay in moving forward, yet charging ahead without expecting to be hit seemed as unrealistic as believing one could walk through a rainstorm and remain dry. The soft, volcanic sand made movement exhausting, but it also swallowed men into shallow depressions where even the slightest cover felt like a blessing. With the assistance of Higgins boats and LCMS, the remaining elements of the regiment had finally managed to reach shore. Despite this, the entire regiment remained pinned down. Japanese guns had destroyed enough landing craft that further landings had to be temporarily suspended. Casualties mounted steadily as the numbers of dead and wounded continued to grow. John gathered another group of Marines and once again headed toward the airfield, moving from shell hole to shell hole. As he cleared the last terrace, he came upon Clinton Waters and several members of his squad. Basilone dropped into a shell hole beside his old friend. Waters had lost many of his men simply crossing the beach. Some had been wounded, while others were still struggling to drag their machine guns over the terraces. The ground ahead, which had seemed relatively quiet during John's earlier advance, had erupted with enemy small arms fire. Waters explained that a pair of Japanese soldiers concealed in a trench system ahead had halted their progress by throwing grenades. John immediately shouted, "Let's you and I go in. You go that way, and I'll go this way. We'll go in." An explosion forced Waters to duck instinctively, but Basilone did not hesitate. By the time Waters looked up and followed, John had already leapt into the Japanese trench and was firing his carbine at the defenders. Once the enemy in the trench had been killed, Waters heard John call something to the effect of, "Let's do this," before charging off again. For the next 20 minutes, it seemed as though every boulder concealed another pillbox. Before Waters could fully grasp either the target or the plan, Basilone was already surging toward the next objective. Many gunnery sergeants might have remained behind to direct the attack, but Basilone consistently chose to lead it himself. He never paused to see whether anyone was following. Waters simply ran after him, and the remainder of the squad followed in turn. As they crossed the shell-torn plateau of burned scrub toward the airfield, artillery fire became even heavier. The Japanese saturated the area in an effort to stop the Marine advance, while American naval guns continued shelling ahead of the assault. Carrier aircraft thundered overhead, dropping canisters of napalm, and small arms fire erupted from every direction. Eventually, Waters, Basilone, and the rest of the squad became separated in the confusion. John still had 4 non-commissioned officers with him as they approached the end of the runway. They dived into several foxholes for cover. A mortar shell exploded directly inside the position occupied by the 4 NCOs, robbing Charlie Company of even more experienced leadership. Basilone rose to continue forward, but enemy bullets struck him in the right groin and neck before another round nearly severed his left arm. John Basilone died on the ground near Motoyama Airfield No. 1 after suffering devastating wounds. Amid the relentless bombardment, the Marines around him were unable to reach him, nor could they abandon their own positions to recover the dead. That responsibility belonged to the grave registration units once the fighting had moved on. Word of his death nevertheless spread rapidly. Clinton Waters first heard the news after reaching the hospital ship later that day. The sailor who informed him had no idea of Waters' close friendship with Basilone. but everyone knew who John Basilone was. Across the international date line, Lena Basilone happened to glance at a newspaper headline on the 19th of February while working in the mess hall. It reported that 10,000 Marines had landed on Iwo Jima. Although she had never heard of the island before, the news unsettled her so deeply that she accidentally spilled a pan of hot grease onto her lower leg and foot, suffering severe burns. She was immediately taken to sick bay. On the 7th of March, Lena spent her 32nd birthday confined to a bed in the base hospital while recovering from the burns she had sustained on the day of the invasion. She had been expecting to leave the hospital that very day. Instead, her lieutenant entered the ward carrying a telegram and quietly spoke with the attending doctor. The doctor then approached her bedside and explained that he wanted her moved to a private room. "You told me I could return to the barracks today," Lena protested. "Just for now," he replied. "I need this room." After she had been wheeled into another room, her lieutenant handed her the telegram. It informed her that Johnny had been killed in action and instructed her not to release any information to the press. She screamed. The doctor administered an injection that rendered her unconscious. When she awoke, she learned she had been granted 10 days furlough, but there was no escaping the reality of her husband's death.